of reality. Prasangika admits three kinds of reliable perceptual cognitions: reliable sensory perception, reliable mental perception, and yogic perception. According to Sonam, these three classes of perceptual cognitions can be divided into two, since they are either perception that directly relies on physical sense organs as its dominant condition, or the perception that relies on mental sense organ as its dominant condition. Out of the three perceptual cognitions, I will focus on the critical analysis of Prasangika's claim that the sensory organs are epistemic instruments in the sensory perception process. For this, I will first look at Prasangika's definition of sensory perception and then examine its rational basis. In the discussion on the five aggregates, Chandrakirti defines sensory consciousness as follows. Visual consciousness is specific cognition of the form in dependence upon the visual sense organ and so forth. Based on Chandrakirti's definition, Zhao Yingxie defines reliable sensory cognition as a cognition which directly, by the medium of physical sense organ, as its dominant condition, is non-deceptive with regard to perceptual as its apprehended object. And here is this definition, and the other one right here. Geshe Lobsang Gyatso also concurs and defines it as an awareness by the means of which a physical sense organ, as its unique condition, is directly and experientially aware of its object. On a closer observation, Prasangika's definition of sensory perception is premised upon two key theses. And here are the key theses. A, that the sensory perception arises from the sensory cognition organs as a specific or a dominant condition, which is unique to the operational process of each individual sensory operation. And two, the definition of reliable sensory perception accords with the mundane convention. The first thesis accounts for a specific condition, which provides, according to Prasangika, necessary epistemic differentiations or individuations between the three classes of perception, namely sensory, mental, and yogic, or between individual perceptions within the same class. For instance, the contrast with visual sense perception vis-a-vis auditory sense perception, altogether with both instances of mental perception, can be explained through the differences between the visual sense and auditory sense as a dominant condition. The second thesis stresses the critical importance of Prasangika's conformity with the way in which reliable sense perception is defined in the world, as we saw in the previous section. Since suffice it here to mention that the reliable cognition is defined in the world as non-deceptive consciousness, and this thesis accounts for the rational basis of Prasangika's adoption of the same definition. I'll focus on the first of these two theses. That's going to be my, basically, I'll skip the discussion of analysis of the first thesis. I tried to do it elsewhere, but in the presentation I'll try to focus on the second thesis. In order to fully understand Chandrakirti's thesis concerning the epistemic role of the sensory organs and its wider application over the Prasangika's theory of perception, I will examine three arguments from Chandrakirti. And these three arguments are the argument from phenomenal structure of the sensory organs, the argument from the sensory organ as a specific or a dominant epistemic condition for the production of sensory perception, and the argument from the emptiness of intrinsic nature of sensory organ as necessary epistemic condition for the epistemic efficiency of sensory organs. So this is the first argument. In his commentary on 400 stanzas concerning the nature and the function of sensory organ, Chandrakirti writes that the eyes, etc., are six organs, forms, etc., as they really are conventionally constitute their six objects. Also, due to the power of the sense organs and their objects they arise sixth sense, sensory consciousness. Therefore, he claims, in this context, it is well known among all systems that every consciousness is dependent arising, and they cease after every moment. According to Chandrakirti, there are 6 types of sensory consciousnesses, because there are 6 kinds of sensory organs corresponding to 6 kinds of sensory objects. There are 2 reasons, argues Chandrakirti, why this argument follows. A, the production of each sensory organ, each sensory consciousness is dependent on the existence of its respective sensory organ and its object. And B, the cessation of each sensory consciousness is dependent upon the cessation of respective sensory organ and its object. Since there are only 6 sensory organs and the respective 6 kinds of objects, the sensory consciousness cannot be more or less than 6 in number. Chandrakirti, in his discussion on 5 aggregates, described the visual sense organ as transparent material form which supports visual consciousness. Although Chandrakirti maintains that all sensory organs are translucent material form, he nevertheless contrasts them on 2 grounds. He contrasts them sensory organs in terms of phenomenal structure and the spatial location of the atomic particles constituting the sensory organs. The atomic particles constituting the sensory organs, according to Chandrakirti, set apart the 5 sensory organs for the reason that each of them are embodied by atomic particles with the varying shapes and the varying spatial locations. He also contrasts the sensory organs in terms of their function, where each has a dominance over the respective objects to which they attend. While the visual sense organs dominate the visual form, so does the auditory sense organs dominate the sound, olfactory sense organ, the smell, gustatory sense organ, the taste, the tactual sense organ, the tactility. The key argument Chandrakirti uses here to account for the reasons behind each sensory organs having dominance of the respective object is that each sensory organ provides the cognitive support for the appearance of the representation of the objective condition, that is, respective objects in perception, since this representation is the intentional object of the sensory consciousness. The visual sensory organ, for instance, can only provide cognitive support for the objective cognition for the representation of visual form to appear in its translucent material form, which in turn becomes the intentional object of the visual perception. Therefore, in this sense, visual sensory organ is said to have dominance over the visual objects, and the same principle holds true with the auditory sense organs and the rest. If sensory organs are translucent material form, and Chandrakirti insists they are, how do we know that they exist? In his reply, Chandrakirti asserts that the sensory organ is a domain of inference rather than domain of perception, cognition. His arguments proceed in 2 parts. The first argument denies that the sensory organs are domain of perception cognition on the ground that they are not directly perceptible. Unlike the great elements, which are directly perceptible as they constitute the domain of tactility, the sensory organs are transparent, visible, invisible material form. Therefore, they lie beyond the domain of ordinary sense organ. This follows since perceptual cognition perceives only those objects that are obvious and self-evident. And given the sensory organs are not self-evident, they do not constitute the domain of sensory perception. The second argument confirms or affirms that this follows partly from the first argument, since the sensory organs are not known through the ordinary sensory perception, they must be known through inferential cognition. The later premise